Hello and welcome. Today I'll be discussing the resurrection of Jesus Christ and whether there's logical evidence as to why we should believe that. We're going to kind of delve into the historical notions of the resurrection and see whether you should believe them or not. And before we even jump into the resurrection and discuss it in specific, I would like to sort of delve into the historical context of in which the time and place when the resurrection is claimed. Does anybody know the first book in the New Testament to be written according to most scholars, and approximately what date was that written? Dr. Raub, would you like to offer an answer?
Mark? 60s?
Close, definitely. So that is the first gospel that is written, and 60s is a great estimate. However, the first book most biblical scholars point to is 1 Thessalonians, written around 51 to 52 AD. Although some historians and biblical scholars do hold that actually 2 Thessalonians was written first, or perhaps Galatians, but generally speaking, the date is between 45 to 55, generally speaking. And why is this important that it's when it's dated? Well, if you look at a lot of ancient history, both Greek, Roman, and otherwise, but particularly Greek history, Alexander the Great, who obviously had an immense impact on the ancient world. We look at the accounts of his life, and most biographies about him were not written until around 300 to 400 years after these supposed events took place. Now, it's very rare that you'll find a historian who's taken seriously who would doubt most of the major events that took place in Alexander the Great's life, and certainly they were extraordinary by all means. So the fact that at the very latest we have at least some writings of people who are very involved in the early Christian community, approximately 15 to 20 years after these events took place, I think that cannot be understated, as many people may claim, okay, the Gospels or the New Testament in general were written much later, and they're sort of just made up as myths, and that nobody actually really believed that at the time. That's demonstrably false, and I don't think even skeptical scholars, I know most do not hold the view that the Gospels were myths. You can see, if you look from historians from the 20th century, 19th century, a lot of them held that, for example, the Gospels of like Matthew, Luke, and John were not written until anytime between 120 to 150, 160 AD, with some scholars even putting the Gospel of John around 190. Scholars, even the most skeptical today, definitely stepped away from that view. The latest most scholars will put the Gospel of John, which is ubiquitously the latest gospel, written at between 95 to say 115. You won't really have scholars who put it any later than that, although you will have some that will put it earlier than 95. But first, I want to get into what most scholars believe about the dating of the Gospels. Most put Mark between 65 and 75, and then most scholars think Matthew came next, between 75 to 85, Luke around 85 to 90, and then John again between 95 to maybe 105. Although that some scholars do believe that, there are also plenty of scholars who hold different dating, and I'm here to suggest that I think that the Gospels were in fact written earlier than those dates claimed. Even if what I say is not true and I'm wrong, and the dates of the Gospels are what most skeptical scholars will put them at, that doesn't really, again, pose any danger to the Christian message, as the latest Gospel is written 70 or 80 years after the events, which is hardly a time for myths and legends to sort of develop. As some historians note, most myths and legends at a very minimum require 2 generations to sort of propagate themselves and really become established. So between approximately 30 to 35 AD, when Jesus died, to even the most skeptical historians who will put John's Gospel 115, that's nowhere near what that difference is not as big as most other historical documents that we take with serious credibility. So I'm going to get into now the specifics of this. Dr. Raub was correct about the first gospel, indeed, was Mark. There are a few that hold Matthew was written first, but that's sort of a not as common view, and we can get to that in a minute. But Mark's gospel, most scholars put it after 70, and the reason for that is because in Mark's gospel, what's recorded is the destruction of the temple. And the destruction of the temple is sort of claimed to be reason why there's no way Jesus could have predicted beforehand that the temple would have been destroyed. So therefore, Mark must have just been writing about this after the fact. And I think that's sort of an unfair view to take for two reasons. One, it's unfair to assume that Jesus couldn't have somehow prophesied about what was to come. That's sort of an immediate bias against the claim of the Gospels in the first place. But two, it wasn't that uncommon for Jews or rabbi to proclaim that the temple would be destroyed. In fact, that was often a source of reasoning for people to say that as God became upset with them based on their sins and in times of unrighteousness, that the temple would be destroyed. That was prophesied in the Old Testament many times, particularly in the book of Daniel. So it's not like this is a far out there claim that only Jesus made. So it's not really that unreasonable to think that Jesus did predict this, and the temple was indeed destroyed when Titus destroyed it in around 70 AD. Now, I would put Mark before 70 AD for a variety of reasons. The first is, so the typical ordering of the writing of the Gospels is Mark, Matthew, Luke, then John. Now, I want to jump to Luke, and we'll come back to Matthew and Mark in a moment. So Luke, there's virtually no historians or biblical scholars who deny that Luke not only wrote the Gospel, but he also wrote Acts of the Apostles, which is, Acts of the Apostles is not focused on Christ's life as his Gospel is, but instead is focused on the early Christian community, particularly Peter, but more so Paul's missions, going and evangelizing throughout the known world. And there's two things that should be noted that are absent in Luke's Acts of the Apostles that I think would suggest that Luke's Acts of the Apostles was likely written around 64 AD, 62 to 64 AD, and that would mean that his Gospel was written prior to that. So we're starting to get into the late 50s here. And those two reasons are, one, Luke doesn't record the death of Paul. So Paul was executed sometime between 64, 65, all the way, some historians put at 68 AD. It would be very odd for Luke to have been recording the whole life of Paul and then all of a sudden just not include like his martyrdom. In fact, Luke records the martyrdom of Stephen and of other notable disciples known within the Christian community. Why would he talk about all these people who had been martyred and then neglect the greatest apostle of all, as he claims in Acts of the Apostles? Why would he neglect him and not include his death? It seems very odd, and the most likely reason would be that Paul hadn't died when Luke wrote Acts of the Apostles. Simply, he wrote it before Paul died, because the account of Acts leaves it off where Paul is currently in prison. And I think that's the first notable thing. And then the second notable thing is, why didn't Acts of the Apostles include anything about the events that were going on in Jerusalem? So between 66 to 70 AD, when the temple was eventually destroyed, there was a Jewish-Roman war going on. And approximately between 1 to 1.2 million Jews died as a result of the fighting during these years. those are no small numbers. Luke was presumably either within Jerusalem or nearby. He was in connection with the Christian community in Jerusalem. This would be akin to someone who's writing about the historical narratives of the 1940s and 1950s and then completely leaving out World War II while also living in, say, Poland or France, which was invaded and at the very front lines of World War II's combat. It's the same thing with the Christian community. Jerusalem, for all intents and purposes, was sort of the heartland of Christianity, is the cradle of Christianity. So the fact that this isn't talked about at all by Luke is very, very interesting. And again, this would suggest that it was written before this war, which started in 66 AD. So you have two reasons to place Acts of the Apostles, at the very latest, 66 AD itself, but potentially even earlier if Paul was martyred in 64 AD, say, under the Neronian persecution. Another thing, why didn't Luke mention the Neronian persecution? Because it hadn't started when he wrote it. And then finally, a very common theme in Acts of the Apostles is why Christianity should be a legal religion within the Roman Empire. And at the time, and the only time, so Judaism had been a legalized religion within Rome. When it became illegal was after the war, starting in 66 and then onward. So why does Luke spend so much time trying to sort of say that Christians are sort of an offshoot of Jews, as they often were viewed in those times? Why does he spend so much time and energy talking about how the Christians are this sort of either offshoot or subset of Jews, or that they're related to Jews somehow, so therefore they should be granted that same legal protection that the Jews were given under the Romans, if he wrote it after 70 or after 66, after 70 AD, in which Jews no longer held those privileges? It doesn't really make sense unless you were to admit that Acts of the Apostles was written before these events. So if Acts of the Apostles was written around, let's put it at 64 AD, Luke's Gospel is probably written maybe 2 years before, so that puts us at 62, and Luke drew a great deal from Matthew, but Matthew drew an even greater deal from Mark, with analysis is showing that about 88% of Matthew's Gospel is taken from Mark, and a similar number for Luke taking from Mark, but at the same time, they also had a common source, which is commonly called the Quell source or the Q source by biblical scholars. And I think that it's interesting to look at those sources and see how they all have sort of a similar narrative of events, these critical events that took place in Jesus' ministry. So if we place Luke at 62 AD, Matthew probably wrote between maybe 4 years before, so that puts us at 58, and then Mark probably wrote maybe 2 or 3 years before that, so around 55, 56, roughly. So that's a very different dating than sort of the more skeptical view that was presented, but I think there's sufficient evidence to sort of say why the Gospels should be dated early. Now, you might be wondering, what about John's Gospel? And that is a bit up in the air, I have to say. There's scholars who place it from as early as 55 AD and as late as, again, 115. So even if we were to grant the skeptic the dating of 115, we still have 3 or 4 very reliable sources about the life of Jesus, and I think that should be enough. If one wanted to look more into that, the early church fathers talk about who may have written the early Gospels, because some people claim they weren't eyewitnesses. And even if that was true, even if none of the Gospels are written by eyewitnesses, it can't be denied. I mean, for example, no Christian scholar would really admit that Mark or Luke experienced the events. Mark says a lot of his sources are from Peter and the other apostles, and Luke is mainly from Paul himself. Yet these people either experienced the events themselves or were heavily involved in sort of these miraculous events that were experienced. So that's the first thing. And even if John was not a first-hand witness, it may have been written by a different John that the early church fathers recognize. And Matthew is again sort of something that's disputed. Some think that it was indeed the very tax collector himself, the son of Alphaeus. But it really is not relevant whether or not they were eyewitnesses, because they were so steeped in this community. And at that time, oral tradition was much more reliable and was very important to this culture. So that's another question. Why did they wait, 20 years after the events to begin writing these things down? Well, originally they were just preaching the gospel and preaching this good news, and there was no need to codify it at this time because oral tradition sufficed. But a lot of the writings and historians think that the reason it was later codified and written down was so that this could be passed on, or to even use it as instruction for later evangelists to come. And evidence of that, if one looks at 1 Corinthians, which is likely written between 53 to 55 AD, so shortly after Thessalonians was written, there is a creed in 1 Corinthians 15 that biblical scholars place any time between 34, which is very early, all the way to 40 AD. So at the very latest, this is 7 years after the events took place. This is very, very close to the events. And there's a few reasons we know that 1 Corinthians was written so early, or this creed found in 1 Corinthians was recorded and sent about the Christian community so early. The first is sort of the structure, which is called the Semitic structure, in which how the creed is structured in a very formulaic way to get the message across. It may have been used as a very early sort of spiel for early Christians to give when they were testifying what they believed in. And the latter is right after the resurrection of Jesus, or at least the claimed resurrection at this point in time, because we're trying to maintain a skeptical point of view. Paul has his conversion maybe 2 years after that, so 35 AD, and then he travels to Jerusalem within that next year or two. So we're approaching 36, 37 AD, and as he gathers this information from the apostles, he codifies it and sort of sends it out to his followers. So as he sends it out to his followers, this message, again, is condensed to make sure that it's easy for someone to memorize, further showing that oral tradition was something that was essential to the early Christian message. So that kind of covers the more historical side of the Gospels and why we should accept the Gospels as historically reliable. Of course, there's a lot more to be discussed, but for the sake of time, I think it's been demonstrated that these indeed are reliable documents, historical documents, and given what they testify about Jesus, we're going to look into sort of a few different views that people may hold about the crucifixion of Jesus, and which is the most likely regarding his passion.